Education is sold as the safest investment you will ever make. Pay now, earn more, later, simple story. But real investments share risk. This one mostly doesn't. If education is an investment, it is a strange one. You pay the full price up front, before any outcome is visible. The institution collecting the payment faces no direct penalty if results disappoint. And when returns fall short, the failure is framed as personal, not systemic. So here is the real question. What if modern education is not mainly an investment at all? What if it is a delayed risk transfer? Labor market uncertainty exists in every economy. The only question is where that uncertainty is stored, and for how long. In today's system, much of it is stored inside individuals. Tuition is the entry fee, loans are the leverage, and the settlement happens years later, when it's too late to unwind the trade. This is not a morality story. It's not about blaming students or attacking universities. It's a structural story about incentives, timing, and who holds the downside when the future refuses to cooperate. Part 1. The investment myth. Let's define a normal investment in plain terms. You commit capital, you expect a return, but you also accept uncertainty. And that uncertainty is priced up front. You can diversify, you can exit, you can limit downside. Education does not behave like that. It behaves less like a bond, and more like an option. You are not buying a guaranteed payoff, you are buying the right to compete. And competition depends on conditions that arrive later: technology, business cycles, geographic constraints, credential inflation. On average, education still pays. In the U.S., median earnings for workers with a bachelor's degree are roughly 70 to 80% higher than those with only a high school diploma, according to Federal Reserve and Census data. But that number hides something crucial. It is an average, not a promise. The system sells probability as if it were certainty. Upfront cost is certain. Time cost is certain. Stress cost is certain. The return depends on a labor market you do not control. If you buy a factory and demand collapses, we call it a bad investment. If you buy a degree and wages disappoint, we call it a bad person. That narrative does important work. It converts systemic uncertainty into individual shame, and it prevents education from being priced like risk. Because if it were priced like risk, outcomes would matter much earlier, and to more people than just the graduate. Part 2. How risk gets shifted. In older labor systems, employers carried more mismatch risk. They hired young workers with incomplete skills. They trained them. They accepted that some hires wouldn't work out. Training was a cost of doing business. That world didn't disappear because firms got wiser. It disappeared because risk got expensive. In competitive markets, uncertainty is something firms try to shed, so employers externalized training. Credentials became the filter. The labor market didn't become safer. It just stopped paying for its own uncertainty. Now the risk sits somewhere else, inside households. Individuals borrow against future income to acquire access, and the scale of that transfer is visible. In the U.S., student loan debt now exceeds 1.7 to 1.8 trillion, spread across more than 40 million borrowers. A student loan is not just a payment plan, it is leverage. And leverage magnifies outcomes. If earnings rise, the bet looks smart. If earnings disappoint, the debt does not adjust. The risk didn't disappear. It moved from institutional balance sheets to individual lives. Part 3. The time delay trap. The most effective risk transfers are the ones you can't feel immediately. That's what time delay does. Education is a long-duration asset. You pay now. You wait. You assume the payoff will arrive. And often, you don't discover the true return for years. Multiple return on investment studies suggest many graduates require 8 to 11 years just to break even on tuition and opportunity costs. By the time reality becomes clear, reversal is impossible. The credential is acquired. The debt is locked in. Alternative paths are gone. There is no return policy for time. This delay insulates the system. When costs rise, the story says it's an investment. When debt rises, the story says it's worth it. When outcomes weaken, the story says you chose poorly. And when many outcomes weaken, the solution is always the same. More education, more credentials, more delay. Later becomes the system's favorite word, because later postpones accountability. Part 4. Who benefits from the structure? This is where people look for villains. You don't need them. Incentives already align. Universities are paid up front. Revenue is decoupled from long-term outcomes. Governments expand access without absorbing full fiscal risk. Loans move cost into the future. Employers receive pre-filtered labor without internal training budgets. And the financial system earns interest on loans that are unusually hard to discharge. None of this requires coordination. It emerges naturally. The individual sits at the center, paying first, waiting later, absorbing uncertainty in between. Because the settlement is delayed, the system can keep calling it opportunity. Part 5. This is not just an American problem. Here's an important clarification. This structure is not uniquely American. You see similar dynamics across advanced economies, just with different funding mechanisms. In the United Kingdom, tuition fees tripled after 2012. Student loan balances now exceed £200 billion, with repayment periods stretching over decades. In parts of Europe, education appears cheaper, but the risk doesn't disappear. It shifts into credential inflation, delayed labor entry, and prolonged dependence on family support. Across the OECD, the average age of stable labor market entry has risen steadily. Young adults spend more years in education, more years in transitional work, and more years carrying uncertain returns. According to OECD data, graduates in many developed economies now take 10 to 15 years to fully realize the expected earnings premium, if they realize it at all. This matters because risk is not just about failure, it is about duration. The longer uncertainty lasts, the harder it is for individuals to adapt, pivot, or reverse earlier decisions. From a system perspective, this is highly efficient. Education absorbs labor market slack. It delays unemployment statistics. It postpones political pressure. It smooths volatility. But from the individual's perspective, it compresses choice. You commit early, you wait longer. And by the time the outcome is visible, your flexibility is gone. This is why the debate often feels emotionally charged. People are not arguing about education itself. They are reacting to a system that asks them to carry macroeconomic uncertainty during the most fragile years of their lives. Part 6. Why this is not about bad degrees. This story is often simplified into moral sorting, good degrees versus bad degrees, smart choices versus poor ones, but the data points elsewhere. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York reports that roughly 33 to 45% of recent college graduates are underemployed, working jobs that do not require a degree. This affects engineers, business majors, and professionals, not just the arts. The problem is not that education lost value. It is that access to professional labor markets became financialized. Outcome uncertainty is priced as personal failure, and the downside sits with the one actor who cannot exit. Education still matters, skills still matter, signals still matter, but structure matters too. Modern education increasingly functions as a delayed risk transfer. Institutions are paid early, outcomes are measured late. And when returns disappoint, the system treats it as private error instead of shared uncertainty. That is why so many people feel trapped after doing everything right. Not because they failed the promise, but because the promise was never designed to protect them from downside. So the real question is not whether education is worth it, it's this. In an economy built on uncertainty, who should carry the risk, and for how long? Stay curious, stay sharp,